microphone's on silent.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, folks. I hope you're all having a lovely day. Welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talks. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the studio and live online. Hello, online people. So whether you're in Bristol or whether you're joining us from far away, you can join in the conversation. If you are online, please do leave any questions or comments in the chat and we will pick them up and I'll share them with the team. My name's Tony. I'm one of the producers here in the team. I am dressed in all black today. Come and ask me about my t-shirt later. I'll be very excited to talk to you about it. Every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time in the space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 p.m. till 5 p.m. An especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio today. Have we got any new faces? You dare to put your hands up? Got 1, 2, 3, so that's more of you than you think, being a little bit shy about it. If you saw any of those hands and you're a resident, please go and say hello to them, make them feel at home here today. So, what is the Pervasive Media Studio for the benefit of those little hands? We are a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. It's a partnership between Watershed, the University of West England and the University of Bristol. We offer studio space that includes desk space and meeting rooms and event spaces like this one. We also invite people to events and have opportunities for our residents, all as part of our spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. We're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make some time for collaboration. Before we start today, just a tiny little bit of housekeeping. We are not at school. Please feel free to move around the space, get up and leave if you need to, come back and join us. I ask that you do it quietly and be careful, there is a web camera there before you get your forehead in it. Feel free to move around, grab a cup of tea or a glass of water from the kitchen over there. We have a quiet space on just the other side of this wall if you need to take a couple of minutes to decompress. The fire exits, there's one at the end of this corridor on the left and there's one on that general direction as well. There's no fire drills for today. If you hear a fire alarm, it is our cue to leave the building. Follow one of the team. I'll be going that way if you want to follow me. Danielle will probably walk in a similar sort of direction as well. She's around too. We've got accessible toilets, which are next to the other toilets, which are next to the kitchen, all in that general direction. As I said, there is a Q&A at the end of this talk. For those of you watching online, please do pop your questions in the YouTube chat. And if you're in the building, raise your hand and I'll come around with a little bit of a microphone. You can get news on any of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio. You can catch us on Twitter for now. Have you all heard about what's happening at Twitter today? Might not be there by the end of the day. At PM Studio UK or on Instagram at Pervasive Media Studio. Now, on with the show. I'm very, very excited to introduce all of our speakers today. We've got a bit of a full house. We are joined by Joe Hyde, Harsha Balasubramanian, Pilar Santaclise, Lisa May Thomas, Tom Mitchell and Clarice Hilton to discuss Soma, a participatory multi-sensory experience which draws from a dance-based approach to using VR technology. Give it up for them, please.
Hi everyone, welcome to our talk. Hi to you here and to everyone online. So I am Lisa. I'm a white woman in my 40s. I've got curly red blonde hair and I'm wearing blue jeans and an orange top. So this first slide contains a couple of images of our Soma rehearsals at the Trinity Centre in Bristol. One of them with our team in a yellow band and the other in VR. So Soma, what is Soma? It is an hour-long participatory multi-sensory experience. It draws from a dance-based approach to VR and it's been developed by an interdisciplinary team of people, some of whom you can see here and will be on the Soma website as well. So just to begin, I want to talk a little bit about the way in which VR uses our senses. So this slide shows a woman in VR with her hands outreached. And as many of you all might already know, VR technology is an immersive technology in which participants use a head-mounted display or a VR headset to create the feeling of being immersed within a virtual environment. And so VR experiences are essentially centered around the screen, which is sort of firmly fixed over a participant's head and secured with straps. The virtual environment seen from within a headset generates its sort of simulated properties towards the participants' senses, and this is predominantly visual information. As the body receives this information and automatically and rapidly reacts, the cognitive system is quite slow to catch up. So the brain is sort of temporarily fooled into being in this alternative world. And although other sensory cues, such as audio and tactile information, might be featured in VR content, these sensory stimuli often just reinforce the visual information, so they're kind of meaningless on their own. So VR's promise of transportation to other realities does depend on the participant's eyes and requires a sensory system which is visually dominant. So this slide shows some of the Soma dancers, all in VR headsets, rolling around on the ground, as dancers generally like to do. And immersion in a virtual environment using VR can lead to a sense of presence, of being there in that environment. And that's not just the case for the environment in which we are placed in VR, but also for our body that we inhabit there, and other bodies through their visual representation. So this sort of illusion of presence, of place and body in a virtual environment relies on a sensory system which is led by vision. So the VR headset is almost acting like a blindfold to the physical world around, even though the body is still physically present there. The sense of being there goes away, and the sensory information from the world around is sort of backgrounded. And the visual information from VR, from the headset, kind of comes to the fore. Body, though, is actually in two places and receiving sensory information from both the physical world and the virtual environment. And there are moments in the VR experience, for instance, when there's a disruption, if you like, and the body's receiving both this information. The body kind of reconnects momentarily to that physical world. Perhaps they've sort of bumped into someone or bumped into a wall, or someone opens a door and there's a breeze. There's these kind of momentary disruptions. And it's usually the case in any sort of VR experience that the creator of that will seek to overcome those disruptions or those moments of sensory confusion as quickly as possible. So this slide shows two of the Soma dancers at either side of a large space between a stretched out large yellow band. So taking a dance-based approach to VR offers an interesting tension in the senses. And this is something that I've been exploring over the last few years, and this is what has sort of resulted in the design and the kind of concept behind Soma. So dancers train the senses using somatic or body-based practices, and these practices decenter visual information and bring into the fore of their sort of attention the felt body and environment. And this enables them to move through spaces and with other bodies with a sort of a tactile awareness and responding with all of the senses rather than being led or dominated by vision. So this sort of dance way of sensing is at odds with how VR wants us to sense. And so going into VR from this sort of dance-based sensory perspective brings up this sort of tension, if you like, in sort of perceiving what is seen in the VR headset and sensing into what is felt in the body and the physical world around. So this is the idea that underpins the design of the Soma journey. So this slide is a sort of sunrise colour with two hands grasping a very tiny thread. So Soma brings together dance-based practices with multi-person VR and is designed to enable participants to engage with and explore together these two sets of sensory information, so the physical, felt, unseen environment and the visual world of a VR headset, which are often conflicting and confusing, as I've spoken about. And this is the sort of perceptual space in which the participants play, and they sort of share their experiences of their different versions of reality, and not prioritising one experience over another or one sense over another. So it's an hour-long experience, and it's shared between 4 dancers and 8 participants. And the 8 participants are made up of 4 VR travellers who go into the headset and 4 VR witnesses who remain in the physical environment with the dancers and who experience the Soma world without entering into that headset through the kind of non-visual senses. So I'm just going to pass on now to Clarice, who's going to describe the Soma journey in a bit more detail.
Hi, I'm Clarice. I am a white woman in my 30s with curly brown hair. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Is it possible just to stop that, maybe? In this image that you can see here is an interesting composition of colours which mimic the virtual world of Soma. There's a dancer holding a yellow string, and you have a viewpoint which is kind of going through the string to their hands. So as Lisa said, the journey is 4 dancers and 8 participants, 4 travellers and 4 witnesses. The journey is led by audio description, which highlights both the physical and the virtual world. It starts with some string play, which, as Lisa was saying, comes from her practice of returning, kind of bringing us into our senses away from the visual before they enter VR, extending the sense of the body. And the dancers show and encourage play with this yellow string that you can see in the image. And this first part is about building a tangible connection between the dancers and all of the participants.
Sorry, Clarice.
No, don't worry. In this next slide, you can see a group of people being led by the next type of string that gets being brought into the environment. This new string that is introduced, we call the jelly string, which has a very different materiality to the yellow string, which we previously were using. And this is much more intimate and lighter and has sonic properties. So the dancers encourage a more delicate play in this part, showing the participants how to sound the string and further kind of creating this sense of connection between everyone. At the end of this part, all the participants are grouped together within this jelly string and led to the next room where the VR journey will happen. And that's what you can see in the image here. And again, they are walked there with their eyes closed, which furthers this sense of connection and trust with each other and the dancers. So now we are entering VR. In this image, you can see a person in the background blurrily, and in the foreground of the photo is a woman with a VR headset on. And so the 4 travellers go into the headsets whilst the dancers and the witnesses remain in the physical space. The travellers are encouraged to keep attention still in the physical world, so they are in between these 2 worlds of the virtual and the physical. And the witnesses are encouraged to keep in dialogue and play with the travellers. And in this image, you can see the Soma world, which is an expansive, simple environment with a soft, dark blue floor, which moves, and a sky that is separated by a horizon. The audio description paints a picture of this landscape and the visual world inside the headset throughout this journey. In this image, you can see the virtual string, which arrives from the edges of the world and hangs in the air with little gravity. The image, you can see the golden string almost appears as chiffon. The participants are handed controllers so that they can play with the string, and this string is also sonified. They can play the string as a musical instrument, and this also further gives access to the visual world for people who can't see it. In the middle section, after they've played with this string, the travellers are again asked to close their eyes to disconnect from this visual world, and their controllers are taken away. A thin string appears as they open their eyes, which has a different sonification, and they can play with hand tracking rather with the controllers. And they pinch this string, which adds a very different way of interacting. This string is almost invisible. In the final part of the VR experience, Pauletta arrives, who is a crackling and a crackling image which is attached to your hands. As you move your hands, it creates constellations which follow them. These can also be controlled by the witnesses to create a visual and auditory world as you kind of trick the VR headset into believing the hands of the traveller, of the witness, are those of the traveller. In this image, there is two people with a very thin string which you almost can't see. The image is looking up at them as they play with the string, and they are silhouettes. The travellers are asked to close their eyes for a final time, and their headsets are taken off. When they open their eyes, they're in a dark space. The light slowly emerges, and a silver thread is handed between all of the participants and the dancers. As the light comes in, this silver thread creates a web between all of the people in the room. There are also 5 mini speakers which have different sounds on them from the Soma world, which are moved around and played with. In this final image, we have a group of people who have just finished their Soma experience. Some are lying down, some are sitting up, and they're all connected by this silver string. The post-VR acts as a way to create a sensory shift as you move from the virtual environment back into the physical world. So one of the really important things about the dance, in this image, there are dancers lying on the floor. There's a dancer lying on the floor next to one of the audience members who is in a headset. It reads, "The role of the dancer guides practices of care with VR." And there is a quote which says, "The kind of care to place someone in their body and to ground them, but also challenge them." Oh wait, so I think maybe your image doesn't have that, but my image that I'm reading off has that quote. So the Soma journey is guided by dancer guides for both the travellers and the witnesses. And we really wanted to encourage intimacy with their self, their environment, and with the people they're going on this journey with. The guides give prompts, suggestions, and support the participants through the worlds, through words, touch, physical play, and through the string play. The guides are there to keep them safe, guide exploration, and encourage them to go out of their comfort zone. This was really was guided by practices of care with participatory performance and technology to give access to everyone and to respond to the individual needs of the people who are in the experience.
Quite grey hair now. This slide shows a dancer and a participant, and the dancer is handing a set of VR controllers to the participant. So we had done quite a lot on Soma before the lockdown, which was quite disruptive. A lot of the launch events were cancelled. But as the years passed and we came out of lockdown, there was a plan to have a few launch events, starting with the Bloomsbury Theatre in May 2002. And we wanted to develop Soma from where it was in its initial incarnation. And one of the main things that we wanted to do was to make the performance, particularly the VR component of the performance, accessible to visually impaired people that we call EIPs. We did this partly at the Watershed downstairs, and then also at the Trinity. Some of the pictures were shown earlier. And then finally, we added the icing on the cake in the Arnolfini over the road. It was clear that for this process, sound was going to be quite an important component, and that was the bit that myself and Joe Hyde were contributing to the project. So before we started this final bit of development, Lisa had given me the brief initially that we have this virtual environment. There's a rope that behaves a little bit like a rope in the physical world, but it floats in midair, there's no gravity. So I was thinking, what should this sound like? And I was working on a project with some physicists about trying to use digital models of physical systems to create sound. We were trying to sonify physical models. And while I was doing some background research, I found this system, which is called the Wablet. It's developed by a PhD student who has no doubt graduated now, called Robert Tubb, who's also a musician called Cursor Minor. And this was designed for a touchscreen. And what you can see on the slide, I'll describe it now, is a kind of spider web type image. And the web is made of models of masses and springs. So the lines are springs and they're connected to masses. And on a touchscreen, you can touch the mesh and then you can move one of the masses around and it then goes into motion according to the physics that dictate the model. And the green line is a path of a type of synthesis called scan synthesis. So you go around this path at the pitch that you want to hear, so you can hear pitch tones. And as it moves around, you can hear the kind of physics of the mesh in the tone of the sound that's playing. So my idea was I actually found the source code for it online. It was old, but I made it work and I ported it to an environment that I could connect to VR. And then I made it so that when people in the virtual environment grab the rope, it was like grabbing the green line and their movements moved the green line around. And it had the same, or not the same, but it had kind of physical properties that were analogous to a rope. And then I made that work in this patch on the right, which is a max patch. So the sound at this point was quite conventional in the way we presented it to people. There were speakers in the room in the similar format that we have in the space here. And then everyone would listen to the sound at the same time. But because there were 4 participants, there were points where the sound became quite congested and it was difficult for people to work out which string was theirs in the sound. So one of the things we did was work with a VR sound designer called Joe Mott to try and make this work in the VR headset. We also added some speakers, which Joe's going to tell us about.
The microphone, Joe.
Oh yeah, do we have a microphone? Cool.
Hi, I'm Joe Hyde. I'm a male in my 50s with hair that's even greyer than Tom's.
Not sure about that.
Striped jumper, always. I'll talk about the slide in a minute and describe it, but just to talk about the motivation between these speakers that you've seen in a few of the slides already. They were mostly featured in the bit at the end, the after space, which was outside of VR. And what we wanted to do there is really focus on the physicality, and particularly the physicality of the sound and how you can feel sounds as well as hearing them. So these speakers they look a bit like Bluetooth speakers, but they're not. They were built specially for the project, and they're not just speakers. They do everything to make the sound. They've got little Raspberry Pis inside them, which run software to generate the sounds. And the sounds relate very strongly to what you heard in the VR, but they're different. And the speakers that you can see in the picture, they're cylindrical. You can't really tell from the picture, but they're exactly the right size to fit in your hand, and they've got a nice kind of texture to them to grip hold of. And they're really designed to be moved around and to pass from one person to the other, and the dancers kind of move them around people's heads and so on, so that the sounds are actually really dynamically moving in the space. One last thing before I hand back is the sounds were designed to work with the speakers, so they're and also to give this tactility. So they're quite close to sort of ASMR sounds, not quite, but they've got this very like the avatars. They've got this crackly quality that really is easy to locate, and B gives you this kind of feel, this kind of tingle, a bit like ASMR. Okay, thank you.
So this slide shows 2 pictures of a workshop that we ran right at the beginning of this final development phase called the VIP workshop. So we did a day-long workshop, 2 workshops, and in each workshop there were 3 visually impaired participants. And on the left, they're engaging with the rope exercise with the flexible string that is at the beginning of Soma. And then on the right, after they've experienced Soma, we then had an hour-long open-ended discussion. The work in progress showing was a very rough and ready initial port of the sound that we got working. And there were a lot of findings that we had from this, but I've summarized kind of 3 points that I wanted to talk about. The first one was that at this point the sound wasn't spatialized, so it was very flat in the ears of the participants. And for the visually impaired participants, that was a big problem because they couldn't locate the rope. It was hard to hear other participants, and it was obvious this was going to be a problem going forward, so that was something we needed to work on. One of the other points that came up was the idea of audio avatars, that people's presence can be heard through their footsteps, the movements of their bodies, their breathing, the fabric of their clothes, and so on. So that brought up the idea of the sound of presence, which was, again, an idea that we wanted to take forward. And then the third point was that the loudspeakers that Joe just talked about had a real impact, because some of the sounds that were played were kind of natural sounds with water flowing and so on, but the way they moved around the space was very unnatural for the ecology that the sounds belonged in. So it made a really nice blending of the virtual and physical ecologies of the spaces we were trying to move people's presence between. And probably one of the most interesting points that came up was that a lot of the participants hadn't experienced VR before. It's, you know, the visually dominated format of the technology had made them, given them the impression that it wasn't for them. But they all felt that the ritual of VR, putting the headset on, being guided by the dancers, gave them that experience of entering a virtual environment, whether it was visible or not. So another thing that emerged from these workshops, on this slide is a picture of Holly Thomas, who's a visually impaired dancer and member of the Soma team. Holly's visual impairment means that she has limited depth perception, but in VR, in Holly's words, she describes it as having hyper 3D. So Holly had a very strong connection to the VR environment and joined the participants in the VIP workshop and did a really amazing improvised audio description of what she could see. And audio description, for anyone that may not be aware, is a practice which generally involves verbalizing visual details in media, which you see in theatres, galleries, museums, and film. So Holly improvised a really vivid and playful audio description of the virtual environment. And one thing that was quite interesting about this was that it became aware that everyone is blind to some aspect of Soma. If you haven't got a head-mounted display on, you're blind to the virtual environment. And if you have got a head-mounted display on, you're blind to the physical environment. And this audio description brought everyone into the same space. And this gave rise to the traveller, the witness role of Soma, the people that didn't wear head-mounted displays, but got access to the virtual environment through the sound. Harsha.
Thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. My name is Harsha. I'm a blind South Asian woman with curly black hair. So usually, as Tom said, audio description requires visually impaired people to be listening to descriptions of the world, given exclusively by people who can see it. This is the same in early experiments of audio description in virtual reality, where the descriptions are delivered live or are pre-recorded. However, the exciting thing about Soma is that visually impaired people are also invited to describe their sensations and therefore participate in the negotiation over what is happening. By opening up the responsibility of description to everyone, each performance unlocked many different improvised styles of audio description, making it clear that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for accessibility, and that access needs to be continuously and collectively shaped. Next slide, please, Tom. So on this slide, we have a picture of me observing at a Soma R&D session with my Braille note in hand. It's the same device that I have in front of me right now. It's a sort of Braille computer, if you like. My role involved working with the team to produce a podcast series documenting our perspectives on the key themes in the project. And this was another medium through which we co-explored how to shift audiences thinking about VR as a purely visual technology towards embracing that sound is an important part of VR immersive experiences. The podcast bears witness to how the Soma performance disrupts sensory hierarchies in VR, but it also captures how this disruption and inclusivity had been embedded deep into the design process from the beginning. The most striking thing for me was how much the team described out loud during our R&D sessions. Our studio spaces, the headset's user interface, the sounds we heard, what we felt. Not all the describing was vocal. We communicated information through multiple modalities, including text, touch, and bodily sounds, like rubbing our hands together. In one particular playful moment of R&D, before the spatial sound had been designed, my colleague Holly and I, who is in the audience today, went into VR, and she tried to help me locate the virtual rope by rubbing her hands at a spot in the physical space where I might be able to come into contact with the rope using my controller. This strategy worked. Here I was being immersed in the virtual world thanks to the sounds in the physical space rather than the stuff inside the headset. This multimodal way of experiencing VR created opportunities to introduce diverse ways of working from our variety of backgrounds, and it avoided the temptation to privilege one sense or practice as the norm. It was possible for me as a blind individual to not just access VR, but to also co-design it. Practices like audio description and the sighted guide, which are very well known in the visually impaired community, are brought into Soma as access tool, are not brought into Soma to fix the so-called problem of disability, but they are integral aspects of the design process and eventually the performance itself. And just before I wrap up, I just wanted to say, talking of which, I did get to experience the Soma performance as a member of the audience. Once the dancers had eased me into moving around, I enjoyed the playful, interdependent way of encountering VR. Considering access early on in the R&D process had helped, I did not feel like a burden when I asked for help, as this was the creative means of participating in and making sense of the performance. Sorry, I knew that would happen.
Quickly get in there behind you.
Okay, your seats.
Okay, so Soma, as Harsha mentioned, Soma was launched this year at the Bloomsbury Theatre in London. We ran 12 performances over 3 days, and we managed around 100 people experienced it. So this slide shows 2 images from our performance there at Bloomsbury. One is outside the studio theatre in the quad space, where the dancers and participants are engaging in the sort of pre-VR string play. And then the second image is when they're in the studio theatre space and they're held within that jelly string that we spoke about earlier. So we managed to collect some feedback from a number of the participants. We completed a survey with about 35 participants, and then we interviewed 12 participants kind of 1 to 3 months after the event. And that was with the help of Maisie Palmer, who is an intern student through a research internship at University of the West of England. So just to briefly share some of our insights from this participant data. Firstly, the participants experienced an increased sensory awareness of their body, of movement, of others, and the environment around them. Particularly through the kind of pre-VR tuning, they noticed how different sensory information kind of belonged to different environments or realities, and they're sort of noticing as well their own navigation of that, as well as the ways in which the dancers kind of prompted and invited their attention. And secondly was the sense of the dancers as a kind of caring, invisible team, and the sort of build-up of trust between the dancers and the participants, which led them to sort of feeling safe in the experience and gave them an increased sense of participatory agency. Whilst the dancer's role did require a level of sort of practical support for the participants, like making sure they're safe in the space at all times, the dancers also challenged the participants to kind of engage more fully and to kind of move into the unknown and sort of go beyond their comfort zones. And there was a definite kind of mix of behaviours in response to the way in which participants kind of perceived and explored the level of freedom and agency they had. Lastly, the participants commented on the sort of residual effects of the experience, both immediately after the event and also kind of on subsequent days. They took away a feeling of being calm and relaxed, that they had undergone a serene, meditative experience, had euphoric and blissful feelings. And this was quite transformative for some of them who had arrived in quite a different mental and emotional kind of state of mind. over to Clarice.
Sorry, I've just lost my notes. So in this image, you can see the residue space or the post-VR space. There is a group of people, some laying down, some sitting, and they're all connected by a silver string. So VR in its current form is very inherently inaccessible. It expects a very normative body. And there's no standard practice like many other mediums of performance for how to provide access in these spaces. So when we were designing Soma, we wanted to go with an equitable approach, thinking about all the senses as equal and attempting to decenter vision in VR, which is incredibly ocular-centric. So one of the main ways we did this is through the dancer guides, and as Harsh has mentioned, this was a kind of interdependent relationship where they were co-creating access with the individual who was at the performance. And it was a very bespoke kind of access where they could navigate what they needed together through words, through movement, through touch. And this really led into the idea of practices of care, with the dancers' guides not prescribing how the experience was going to go, but by building trust together, keeping them space and providing invitations. We all believe this is a very important conversation to have, especially in this new medium of performance, which is innovating and creating incredible ways of doing performance, but often without the thought of disabled users. So we were really questioning what disability-centered work could look like.
Hello, that's me now. I am Pilar. I am a Latin American woman in my early 40s, and I am the producer of this project, one of them, because there have been many producers throughout the different stages of the project as well. But I've had the luxury to see it through its termination and also to think of the future. So yeah, I'd just like quickly to sort of share what are our plans and ideas for Soma in the future. And basically, after the experience at Bloomsbury Theatre and wrapping up what's been like a really long process of research, designing, and finally staging the piece, we sat down in the summer with Lisa and said, what's next? What do we do with this? And we realized that given that all the feedback we've had was so rich and how impactful it had been in the participants, there was a massive opportunity for us to see how we can push it and move this into a sort of wider spectrum of society. So we started sort of searching for help, and we were approached by CAMERA, which is the Centre for the Analysis of Motion, Entertainment, Research and Application. And they put us in touch with the Department of Psychology at Bath University, and they're both now supporting us in this journey of trying to expand the reach of Soma and get it to as many people as possible. So we want to make it as flexible and portable we can, so it can reach multiple working teams of people in different fields, particularly those, for example, in the health service, or those working in care, or even in the corporate sector. So we would like to explore how we can take the experience into places that are not necessarily the creative area or a stage. So that's where we are at now. And welcome for many questions now, and obviously collaboration, people who would like to give us their ideas and feedback. And yeah, we'll be absolutely open for it.
Thank you everyone for listening.
Round of applause, please, everybody. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. It's so lovely to hear about all of your amazing work. Are there any questions in the room? Are there any questions online? Please do pop them in the chat. Vic is on it. Any thoughts? I've got a question, if not. Okay. I'm going to come back to you all in a sec, though. So, it was really lovely to hear about kind of all the different things that you brought together for that. And I guess my question is around, where did it start? Did it start with a piece of tech and some tech that you were looking to engage with, or did you start with some communities and some particular needs in mind, or is it around kind of that? I love the phrase deprioritizing sight as an idea. Like, which challenge did you start with, and then what came afterwards? If that makes sense. I don't know who I'm asking this question to. Sorry.
So it kind of came from my body, my experience of VR. So I'm a dancer. Okay. I've done a lot of work in sort of somatic, body-based, sensing, moving practices, and a lot of that has involved closing my eyes, using touch as a way of navigating other bodies and environments. And so, I went into VR probably for the first time in 2016, and as soon as I went in, I couldn't work out what was quite wrong, but there was this problem, this tension. And so I did a PhD, but that was the kind of question really that I was trying to kind of unpack. Why was I experiencing this kind of discomfort? And then realizing that it was because of the way in which I had sort of trained my senses away from this sort of visual dominance, if you like, more synesthetically, that was coming into this kind of conflict with how the technology was kind of wanting me to follow vision with my senses, if that makes sense. So that's where it all came from, to answer your question. So
then there's there was a challenge to the tech to meet the needs that you had in the dissonance that you were facing then, yeah.
Yeah, or more like a meeting of me and the tech. Yeah. And like, well, that's what the tech does. This is how I feel and sense. And rather than just going, oh, well, that's what I need to do because the tech is wanting me to do that, if you like. Not that the tech is a person, but like, you know what I mean? It's designed like that. Just investigating the trouble of it. Right. What is the trouble and what can that lead to? And actually that can lead to really rich kind of information.
And where did that motif of the lovely idea of this kind of the physical string and a digital string, where did that come into it, or how did that grow?
I think it was when was that? Working a bit with Becca Rose, who's a pervasive media student here, because she does a lot of work with materials, and I think whether she taught me some string figures, cat's cradles. So I got really into like cat's cradles for a while, and then doing, the cat's cradles that you do on your hands, doing that on bodies, so like expanding that into spaces. And then we tried putting that into VR. But then we're just falling over the string because we couldn't see it. So then we're like, okay, yeah, no. But actually there's a way that it is connecting us through space without physically touching. And so I also found that when I was in VR, if I was in contact with another body, that was almost too much. But if I was in contact with an inert object, that was not interesting enough. So the strings were kind of like this dynamic materiality, if you like, that I could keep hold of while still being kind of engaged in that visual world in the headset.
I love it. Thank you so much. I haven't heard the phrase cat's cradle in about 20 years.
We got obsessed with it for a while.
There's a question online, maybe. Oh, sorry, I did not see you. I'll come back to you.
Hi. There's a question online. It's from Madeline. She starts by saying, absolutely brilliant, a wonderful example of including the audience in crafting the experience. And then she goes on to ask, the disconnect between the visual and the tactile inputs of VR experiences can cause people discomfort and nausea. Did you find the audience members struggled with this?
No.
Nobody.
Oh yeah, go.
I'm just because after the performance at the Bloomsbury Theatre, we had a space for the participants to come and talk to us about the experience. So we gathered a lot of sort of comments, fresh comments, and I was wondering about that actually at some point. Would anyone come with some feelings of being dizzy? And nobody at all. On the contrary, all the emotions were very pleasant. So people felt really comfortable and they enjoyed physically the experience a lot. So, yeah. I don't know if you want to say something else.
You know, yeah, I just think we were giving them the sort of tools, if you like, to ground them in their bodies in that kind of really embodied sense of being kind of connected to each other, to the physical kind of space, if you like. And so that kind of carried on playing through when people kind of entered into VR, and that relationship to that physical environment, albeit an unseen relationship, continued as part of that experience as well. So that, I don't know, that kind of groundedness and that sort of form of embodiment in VR may have had a role to play in the fact that people didn't then get discombobulated in that.
Thank you. There was another question. We've got two. Yes, yeah, we'll come back. Yeah, is that right? Either one.
I've actually got two questions, but I'll ask one now and maybe later. So I come from a dance background, and I'm very interested in this idea that you were talking about, that it's actually quite different in the physical world to the VR world. Using dances, you're also healing in the body. Because I actually think slightly differently about dancers, because dancers actually think in their head about spatial awareness. And so, you rehearse everything in your head, and then suddenly you can do it in your body. And to me, that seems like it's actually got similarities with what's going on in VR. I'm also aware of other dancers who have really strong spatial awareness. In particular, one who recorded a video online, a music video online, and did not plot in advance, but performed therefore 3 times with himself in the same space, but without overlapping himself. And that's quite an incredible thing to do. The producers were really terrified because he had no plot beforehand. And then just did it with apparently only a very few takes. You would have thought multiple takes to check it on the screen. So it's sort of heading in the same direction. And I don't know if you've got a comment about, I was thinking about all these people in VR, how do they not sort of stumble over each other? Because they're now blinded by the headsets.
Yeah.
So I would feel troubled by that because I'm so in my body and
I mean, I think the dancers are caretaking the space, so there's a sense that you're not going to bump into stuff because there's the presence of the dancers. They're there to make sure you're safe, but they're also not just there to do that. They're there to also provoke and challenge you to kind of explore your senses. I mean, it's interesting what you say. I think it comes down to how you sense in your imagination almost. Like, do you have really visual imagination? And some people. So I think that would probably be different for different people. And I don't know if you want to say something about, because you're a dancer and the way you sort of.
Holly, can I give you a microphone?
Sense visually. Well,
How do you kind of map?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, like, working spatially is a really felt experience, particularly because of not having hardly any depth perception at all. So I don't really feel like, for me, I have a capacity to practice something in my head that is spatial. I have to have a very felt experience of that. Although it was super interesting, the first time I went in the VR and completely surprised me was that because I then did have visually I could see in 3D, I suddenly had a really strong felt experience of like relationship to space in a way that I hadn't done through the visual before. So yeah, that was interesting to, and Lisa and I spent a bit of time kind of researching what that might mean, like bringing that out of the VR. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll take that. We've got one more online. Wonderful.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, I've got a question from Verity. She says, I really appreciate the way you create a fixedness between physical and virtual worlds. Do you have any tips for designers wanting to bridge this gap when many view VR as an out-of-body experience?
There's a lot of smiles on the panel.
Do I taking this as well? Well, you can take this, Tom.
No, I'll leave it to you.
So what is it again? Tips for people designing VR to keep them grounded in that experience?
Yeah, so so she's talking about the way that you create that connection between the physical and the virtual worlds, and any tips for designers who want to bridge that gap.
Yeah, I mean, it's something about attention and how you kind of shape that through the journey, like how you're curating attention almost, and how you're using that. So are you creating something visual and then taking it away, and then are you asking that person to kind of find that through other senses? In the middle of Soma, we ask people to close their eyes for a moment, right in the middle of the experience of the VR section, just to sense, to feel their feet on the ground, to breathe for a moment and to sort of enter back in. And so little kind of, little mini kind of interruptions to this kind of continuous visual flow, these little reminders and prompts. And that, obviously in Soma, that's done by the dancers and also by the fact that we have these sort of multimodal approach to VR. We have the sonification of the strings, but it could also be kind of more automated than that, But I think playing with visuality and then taking that, maybe taking that away could be a really interesting kind of way to go, and maybe giving people agency around that as well would be really kind of interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, Tom's got a thought. And Joe.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a good question. I've got good question, Verity. One of the things that I noticed. Oh, I've got a mic. Yeah.
Oh, and the priming.
I noticed about.
Say about the priming.
Yeah. So Lisa, like being there when Lisa was experimenting with VR initially, I would say you didn't really like it. You were trying to. That was where the strings came in. Really, you were desperate to be in contact.
Yeah.
With something physical. And the one thing about Soma that I think is, fairly unique is that the journey of participants is not just, it doesn't start with a headset going on and end with it being taken off. There's like a kind of a much longer experience that leads into VR and out of it. And probably VR, in terms of the time that people spend in Soma, is actually quite a short amount of time.
They're probably like equal parts, I would say.
So I don't know if it's advice for people, but I think that's people respond to that very well. And VR being a kind of like a vehicle for a wider experience, I think is a nice approach to take, and something that's come from Soma.
Well, I think, and the first phase in Soma is about priming and tuning the senses. So you're giving people tools to then engage in a different way, which I think is also, it's part of the design, obviously. Joe, you were going to say.
Yeah, this might be one too many answers to the question, but it is a really good question. And my answer is, I know I keep my coffee in. I'll do it in a minute.
Oh.
Sorry.
It's all right. The rest of it can wait. It's fine. It's fine. It's only. It'll mop up.
I think it was nearly empty.
It'll mop up.
All I was going to say is that the use of sound, I think, is a really good way of staying embodied somehow. I think vision and sound work rather differently in those ways. So vision is inherently takes you out of yourself. You have a gaze. So you're often, if you're watching a screen, you kind of feel yourself entering that world and going out of yourself. Whereas I think sound, you stay in yourself. You don't hear at something. You hear everything around you. And so I think from my experience working with projects, and I would say this because I work with sound, it is a way of sort of slightly solving that problem, especially I think if you work in different ways with sound, so sound in spatial ways and with speakers. And we use things like, do you remember we used those, what were they called? The headphones that work through your bones rather than through your bone conductor headphones, which we didn't carry on using, but I think, and I suppose other senses as well, but sound particularly brings that, I think.
Holly wants to add too.
From my perspective as well, I felt like there were a couple of other things that really supported that. So one was that, like when I came into working on the project, the dancers already had like an anchoring score. So there was already this spoken score that supported guiding somebody through the participants through the process. And it felt to me, when I first went in, that was super clear of like this real a very physical anchoring in your own body, in the real space and in the virtual space. So somehow that brought them together. And I think the way that we then worked with the script for the audio description was that I kind of I really tried to stay with that being in that same vein of anchoring, so this sense of kind of anchoring and pulling those different things together, I guess. And then the other thing I felt was that, like, I compared to some more standard VR that I've been in, like the design of the visuals in Soma is very spacious, and it doesn't it's not like visually busy. So quite often, like for people who are visually impaired, one of the things that is can be a challenge is like visual clutter, you know, and like if it's a really busy visual world, then I suspect it probably takes us all out of our bodies a little bit if we use sight at all in any way. And I think like the Soma design felt really different from that, because it was very, very spacious in the way that it was designed.
I don't know if either Clarice want to say anything, or are you good? Anything to add? You're on mute. Can't hear you.
I don't have power.
Oh, there you go. I can hear you now.
We got you.
I'm not sure if I have that much more to add. I think like there's lots of ways. I think that you can use lots of ways to do it, but I think as long as you're thinking about it in the process and you're actively engaging with that in your work, thinking about ways to invite the participant, the audience, to think about their body, to think about outside of the visual, then like that's a really good place to start.
Thank you very much. I think, team, we might be out of time. If you are in the room and have got any more questions, we're going to leave before anybody spills anything else today. If you're in the room and have got any more questions, the team is around. Do stop and ask some questions. If you've got questions online, I assume in a minute there's going to be a really slick slide with some email addresses on it. If not, I'm sure you can get hold of them. We can help you out with that. Do get in touch and ask your questions. That's a really lovely, thoughtful piece of work. The last thing that I've got to say today is, can we have a round of applause for the team? Thank you very much, everybody, and those who are joining you online. If you do want to stick around in Hot Desk today or find out more about what we do, then please come and find one of the studio team. Studio team, raise your hands, please. We've got Vic and Danielle over there, and we'll be happy to help. If you're watching online, drop us a line at studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions or thoughts or comments you might have. Thank you all for being here today. Please join us next week, same place, same time, different team. Have a lovely weekend. See you later. Cheers.
Like a sea of tea.